Sweden, the highly taxed poorhouse. LO, which is the Swedish labor union, demands a tax shock for Sweden. How would it be instead if the national organization, which is LO, asked itself where all the tax money goes? The other day, LO presented a new tax policy, a long list of new levies LO believes must be reintroduced or increased. New wealth tax in the long run, new property tax, new inheritance tax, new tax on gifts over 50,000 crowns, increased tax on higher incomes. At the same time, the popular square and root deductions must be abolished. First thing, this word new, what does it mean? It means fucking nothing. These are all taxes: the wealth tax, the property tax, the inheritance tax, the gift tax. These are all taxes that we had in Sweden, like previously, not even that long ago, but that we have since abolished with a general change in, for example, our tax policy. Here, this article is framing it as this is something like new. This is something that, oh, we don't know how this will work in Sweden. We don't know what effects it will have on our economic incentives and our decision-making process, when this is absolutely not the case. These taxes have all existed in Sweden, and they've been abolished under like the right-wing, under the right-wing's governments here in Sweden, and some of them during the social democratic ones as well. It's really disappointing. So these are all like not new taxes. These are taxes that we had initially, which we should absolutely have. Like there are a bunch of other like countries in Europe, and even the US has some taxes on on property tax, inheritance tax, gift taxes. But we in Sweden, we have abolished all of those within the past like few decades, really. And it's not great. Judging from the list, one might think that Sweden is a kind of low tax country in dire need of tax revenue, but if there's something that's not lacking in Sweden, it's taxes. In an international comparison, Sweden belongs to the top league when it comes to tax pressure. In 2018, Sweden had the 4th highest tax burden in the OECD. Our tax burden is about 10 percentage points higher than the average among OECD countries. An ordinary police officer or nurse pays more than half of their salary in taxes. When employer contributions and taxes on consumption are included, marginal taxes are still very high. So, this is true. Our tax rate is too high, in my opinion, for laborers, for people that rely on a paycheck from an employer to be able to sustain themselves, 100%. And our taxes on capital, on taxes on ownership, on being the employer is way, way, way too low. We actually have probably, I think it was like last time I checked, it was the greatest, but at this point it's probably one of the greatest, I'm not sure, but we have one of the greatest discrepancies between the amount of tax burden employers versus employees have here in Sweden, which means that like the difference there is that our employees just in general in Sweden pay so much more in taxes relative to employers than practically any other like developed country within the OECD. And that's the reason why we have such high taxes on employees, which should absolutely not be the case. We need to put more tax burden on the people that are, number one, more likely to be making more money, which is going to be capital owners as compared to employees. This will, number one, increase just general tax revenue. This will, number two, make quality of life and social mobility easier for people in general who work jobs instead of like owning, factories and owning companies. This will, number three, create more economic stimulus, because typically people who are, employees and who are generally poorer than people who own businesses tend to spend their money more. So the money will circulate more in the economy rather than being saved or put in an offshore bank account. Basically, we need to eliminate this discrepancy we have between capital taxes and taxes on labor, and we need to reduce the taxes on labor and increase the taxes on capital. Raising taxes further on capital, jobs, and entrepreneurship. Do you see how they lump these all in one, right? The capital jobs does not belong with capital and entrepreneurship. Also, entrepreneurship is a very, very, very broad, like what's it called, like an umbrella. There's a reason why they're lumping them all three and don't want to clearly differentiate between, taxes on labor and taxes on capital. Does not benefit Swedish growth and competitiveness, nor does it benefit welfare in the slightly longer term. Welfare is completely dependent on companies and entrepreneurs having good conditions so that new companies, jobs, and tax revenues emerge. So this is the argument of basically, hey, if we put taxes too high, then everyone will leave Sweden, lol, which is just a completely awful notion for a whole set of reasons. Number one, it hasn't really been historically demonstrated that there's been like a cause and effect through the raise of like capital. Number two, you will never, ever, ever be able to outcompete the capital taxes in countries like, for example, Southeast Asia, where a lot of companies are basing their production so that they can pay less taxes. There's no way Sweden will ever be able to reach that level of like capital, like, you know, tax differences. Like their entire economy runs on attracting big businesses through like beneficial tax incentives. There's no way we will be able to do that as well. And then lastly, Sweden is already like the greatest country, like by a pretty significant margin, or like one of the greater countries by a pretty significant margin when it comes to the discrepancies on taxes on labor and capital. So as such, like a bit of a mitigation and a bit of a change there would put us, like, if anything, let's like at par with other developed nations within the OECD, you know, within like Europe and the United States. So like there's like 3 reasons why this, you know, notion doesn't really make sense, and is generally like a bit, you know, like a bad concern, or like an unfounded one, I suppose. Instead of looking with lights and lanterns for new changes, LO should be interested in where our tax money goes. Why is there a constant lack of tax money in high-tax country Sweden? Take aid, for example. Despite the fact that Sweden is a small country on the outskirts of Northern Europe with only 10 million inhabitants, politicians have assigned us the role of world conscience, a legacy from Olof Palme's days. Little Sweden has the 6th largest financial contributor to the UN system. How reasonable is that? The solution to this is that Sweden is not being unreasonable. The other countries are being unreasonable. Sweden is being extraordinarily reasonable. That is one of the few things I can say that, hey, I am proud of Sweden, because they were able to, because of like the fact that we, the way we like work internationally when it comes to international aid and collaboration and stuff like that. That's one of the things that we do pretty well when it comes to that. And it's one of the things that, you know, these people, you know, seek to undermine. And also implicit in this is the fact that this money isn't, you know, isn't like spent here, but I can guarantee that that amount of money is probably better spent through aid than domestically when it comes to like the cost effectiveness of the given issue. On top of that, issues like this relating to how much aid one gives and relating to like what's it called, like taxes on capital and on labor, these are things that could easily be like regulated on a broader level through trade unions of like, for example, the European Union. So having, for example, like a union-wide tax rate on certain things will reduce the individual threats to competitiveness that comes with one country increasing their what's it called, their capital gains tax, for example, and will make that the general situation a lot more a lot more palatable for an individual country, as well as if the whole like union has a similar tax policy, and because the union as a whole has a lot of like geopolitical strength when it comes to international economics and just general geopolitics, that will serve as a counterbalance to the higher capital gains tax, which will still incentivize the establishment of larger corporations. Aid this year amounts to 46 billion Swedish crowns. This year it grew so strongly that SIDA's CEO, Karin Jeppman, considered it would be a challenge to get rid of all the money. There are pure absurdities in development aid policy. Several countries have recently frozen or reduced aid to Palestine due to reports of corruption and the use of funds to remunerate terrorists. No general elections have been held in the country since 2006, so what does Sweden do? Last year, the government decided on a 5-year strategy for Palestinian aid with a price tag of 1.5 billion as a pat on the back. So when it comes to stuff like this, number one, if it's the case that that money is being like ineffectively allocated or is not being allocated correctly, then yeah, of course, then don't do that. This is not a critique on international aid as a whole. This is a critique more of just generally like just being pragmatic with the money once you've already decided to do international aid. So this is a conflation between criticizing international aid and criticizing bad examples of international aid. Additionally, this article doesn't talk about exactly like how this new 5-year strategy will work, where the money will go. If it seems likely that we'll fall into the same pitfalls as other developmental foreign aid policy that is mentioned earlier in the paragraph. Like there isn't enough information given here, and there's a confusion between attacking an implementation of international aid versus attacking international aid as a, you know, as a concept. And at home, politicians and officials find themselves in one absurd area of spending after another. This year, hundreds of millions of tax kronor were to be burned on subsidies for electric bicycles. Millions and millions were awarded in project grants for everything from climate anxiety therapy to how climate policy is negatively affected by traditional masculine norms. Okay, a few things here. Fuck, you notice how the electric bikes is the only thing they put a price tag on. But yeah, so electric bikes, yeah, we should spend the money better. Electric bikes are pretty cringe. I don't know why the labor union would care about electric bikes, really. This seems like a weird like attack here. But furthermore, note how they lumping things like, for example, like like therapy for a very real and psychologically established like type of anxiety that is predominantly affecting young people, and talking about like what a panel on how climate policies is negatively affected by traditional masculine norms. Like, what does this even mean? The fact that they haven't like labeled exact like numbers as to like how much is going to this, which is a pretty like significant cost, which should definitely be adjusted for, because mental health is very important and it's something that has been on the, you know, the downfall over the past, I don't know how long, in most, you know, like developed nations. And comparing that to, I don't even know what this is, like a panel on how traditional masculine norms affect climate change policy, and just saying that all money's being spent on this without differentiating between it, makes it seem like, oh, everything is just dumb and is a waste of money. In the childhood of the labor movement, people sang in the first May trains about how we dig under taxes, and Gustav Möller proclaimed that every wasted tax crown is a theft from the people. A penny from grandpa and grandpa must pay the gift. What is this last part? Penny from grandpa and grandpa must pay gift tax. This is a bit of weird translation because the article is originally in Swedish. But yeah, I mean, like wasted tax crowns is a theft from people. Yeah, don't fucking waste tax money. True. We should use our tax money effectively. And you in this article have not made a great an argument against that. Like the prescriptions of ELO are to use the tax money ineffectively or whatever. There is the international aid one, which you don't explicitly say that you're against or anything. You just say there's a lot of money being spent, and I agree. The fact that Sweden spends so much relative to other countries isn't good. The solution is that other countries should also spend more. Then there's a bit of like really like vague posturing at a bunch of different projects and where tax money is going, while not providing sufficient information to be able to adequately critique the allocation of the resources. Then there is the fact that a lot of these like goals are not by any means like perfectly congruent with like the goals of ELO, so it's not like there's a hypocrisy being pointed out here on anything. Then there is the things about just general tax policy, them saying that it's going to negatively or adversely affect the economy when it just doesn't seem to be the case, and then just a misunderstanding of generally the issues we face within tax within tax revenue in Sweden as a whole. And then there's a framing of all these taxes as being new, despite the fact that we had them and we abolished them under like greater like privatization reforms that we have seen over the past few decades. So yeah, shit article. Thank you whoever linked this, because this was interesting to go over.